that sort of brings us to the very contemporary issue of ketogenic diets. And I hope you like the way I colored the letters. Okay. It's a major issue, and I did hear today that the interview that I did in London about this, where it said, no one should do a ketogenic diet, apparently went to every ketogenic website, and I'm the person who's vilified. I did see some of this on Twitter. I don't spend a lot of time looking at the negative stuff about me on Twitter, because the thing about it is that it's not nuclear cardiology, it's not cardiac CT, so I'm actually not the researcher. You didn't see Williams on any of these things, okay? So except the hypertension guidelines, okay, I'm guilty on that one. But all of this stuff is what I'm reading and evaluating the science, and I put it out there. So when they attacked me for being a shill for the sugar industry, really? I would think that a ketogenic diet is actually better than sugar, believe it or not, based on the data that I'm reading. But I would say that what we really need to focus on is whether or not this increases mortality. And does it improve weight? You bet it does. This is Atkins. This is what Atkins does. Is that impressive? Yes, it is. But is it short-term? That's really the issue. Short-term gain and long-term mortality. And so there was a wonderful article that tried to do several things at once, a review article, a meta-analysis, and then primary data, where they looked at large data sets, such as the atherosclerotic risk in communities, ERIC, and you put all this data together, and they came to the conclusion that high carb is bad for you, low carb is bad for you. And what you really should be doing is complex carbohydrates and keeping it about 50 to 55% of the calories in your diet, okay? If you're doing a low carbohydrate diet from animal products, it's associated with a higher mortality. And if I could go back to June of last year when I did that interview that got all over everybody, I would modify what I said to no one should do a ketogenic diet. No one should do a ketogenic diet with animal products because this study showed very clearly that if you do it with plant-derived proteins and fat, vegetables, nuts, peanut butter, whole grain breads, that's actually associated with a lower mortality. What they're seeing with the ketogenic diet is not just pleasing to the eye, weight loss. They're seeing an improvement in diabetes because when the weight goes down, the insulin resistance goes down. And so that's very attractive, but you don't want to get that gain metabolically and pay the price with plaque development in the coronary arteries. Okay, so if you compare the two, animal-derived low-carb diet has about an 18% increase in mortality. If you look at the plant-based one, it's about an 18% decrease in mortality. And that is the beautiful curve that they showed, showing that it's dose-related. So people who do a little bit of a ketogenic diet are not as bad as the people who do moderate or severe. That's the increasing mortality on the left side of the curve. On the right side, that high-carb diet, and high carb, again, every time we see this, it's the same thing. And just like the PURE trial, okay, every time you see a high carb diet, you're talking about refined carbohydrates that people should be avoiding. And so this is the analysis, the review of the literature, showing that their data is very consistent with previous publications in Nurses' Health Study, her health professional follow-up study. And this is the PURE trial that really didn't look at low carb at all, but it did look at high carb. I'll keep going back to that because eating sugar is bad for you. The PURE trial showing that high carb is bad actually overlapped their data almost perfectly, even though it was done in 19 different countries. There is a nice systematic review of this that has even more data, and it conflicts only in terms of the amount of mortality, not the direction. And so all-cause mortality goes up, no question about it. You can look at each of the articles and be convinced that there's about a 30% increase in mortality if you're doing the low-carbohydrate diet. I have to throw one American Heart Association journal article out there because many people come to want to change their diet after a heart event, if you've had a heart attack, so-called myocardial infarction, and you do a low-carb diet, it isn't 18% increase or 31%. It's actually a 53% increase in mortality. So please, tell all your heart patients, everyone you come up against with this discussion, that if they have had a heart attack in the past, please do everything they can to avoid an animal-based, plant-based diet. Okay, what's wrong with it, the animal-based, plant-based diet? Well, it's got red meat in it. And this data is not new. It's been out there for a long time. Red meat kills. Processed red meat kills faster. It's dose-related. People who say everything in moderation, well, take a look at the curve. The biggest increase in mortality, the biggest slope change in the curve is between 0 and 1 per day. Now, and I've been asked this at this conference, I don't have data so much on once a month or twice a month or anything like that, but once a day, definite increase in mortality. What's the best thing that we could do? In this data set, it was actually substituting nuts for processed red meat gave almost a 25% decrease in mortality. Okay? What is wrong with processed meat? Well, one of the major issues is the development of heart failure. And so that is the heart failure incidence goes up when you're eating red meat, particularly processed meat, by about 28%, and a 243% increase in mortality if you have heart failure. So everyone you know who has heart failure should go plant-based pretty much immediately. Now, heart failure is interesting. Coronary heart disease, but how does it fit with overall mortality? So this is the article that I probably quote more than anything else, and that is the Journal of American Medical Association Internal Medicine that looked at the Nurses' Health Study and the Health Professional Follow-Up Study, and it gets a lot of criticism because it was done with food frequency questionnaires, as if doctors and nurses can't fill out a food frequency questionnaire. There's two other notable criticisms of this article before I show you what it showed. One is that those food frequency questionnaires are just noisy. That is, people put random responses. They know they're supposed to fill it out, but they fill it out quickly. They don't really have 24-hour recall. They just put random stuff on there and send it in. Well, anyone who's ever taken a statistics course or been in a physics lab, you know about entropy, you know about random effects. You know that if you have random noise in your sample, that's actually going to decrease your ability to make associations. It's going to decrease your ability to make a statistical significance because it increases the standard error. So when you do find, if you have a noisy data set and you do find a relationship, if anything, the relationship is actually stronger than what you're measuring, okay? The other criticism, I think, is valid. That is, they called out people who have at least one cardiovascular risk factor, 131,000 of them with at least one cardiovascular risk factor. I don't know that that's a criticism. I think that's just informational. There may be people with no risk factors who could eat whatever they want. But for most of us who have at least one cardiovascular risk factor, we ought to be very careful. So here's the data. At the bottom, it has other. I have no idea why processed meat increases non-cancer and non-heart disease death. Is it if you eat bacon, you don't wear a seatbelt? I have no idea what that means. Okay. But with the cancer part, there was a surprise, and that was that the World Health Organization's Class 1 carcinogen, processed meat, had a 14% increase in mortality in this data set, and eggs actually exceeded processed meat in its relationship to cancer death. That was kind of a shock to most of us. When you move up a little bit and look at the cardiovascular part, you notice that, for those of you who are statisticians in the audience, you notice that, dairy increased mortality 0.89, that's an 11% increase. Eggs increased 12%. Fish increased mortality 12%. But the eggs don't reach statistical significance. And why is that? Well, it's because the error bars are wider, and they cross 1.0, so therefore the egg board could look at this and say, see, it's not statistically significant. Well, what makes the error bars larger is having a smaller sample size. So why would the sample size be smaller? We found out on the previous slide. Because they died of cancer, and dead people don't have heart attacks. Okay? So, red meat is worse than the other four, okay? But processed red meat has a uniquely high relationship with heart disease, and a lot of that is heart failure, as we noted before. If you look at the top half of this inset, it really is talking about all animal products, and so when I read this and I was quoted as saying, I mean, it's not really me, that there are no safe animal products for human consumption, well, that is true if you have any cardiovascular risk factors. And processed red meat is the worst of the lot, followed by eggs, then red meat, then the rest.